Okay, so today we're going to start reading chapter 23, Orphan of Ellis Island. When we left off last time, um, Salvatore had died, okay? Antonio was out in the courtyard, and then Dominic heard them singing Home, Home on the Range. Okay, chapter 23, page 119. Senor Garcia sat at Salvatore's bedside, chanting and wailing, as was the custom in that city when someone died. Dominic was glad that he could leave the room. He had never seen anyone die on TV before, except on TV. And when a person died on TV, the body didn't stay around. A hearse usually came and it was whisked away out of sight, but no one came for Salvatore. He was still lying on the bed. Dominic didn't like the wailing. It sounded too sad and scary. He wanted to get as far away from it as he could. He followed Francisco up to the loft where Antonio had hidden himself under a quilt. Father Tommaso climbed the wooden ladder after them and sank down on a rickety old chair. "You must not wait for the burial," he said. "The ship leaves at noon." "I don't want to go without," Francisco's voice choked with a sob. "I know it's hard, Francisco," Father Tommaso said gently, "but you must think of yourself and your little brother. Maybe if Salvatore had been in America, there would have been a doctor and medicine to save him. In America, he wouldn't have had to fill his empty stomach with cherry pits. In America, you'd have the chance for a better life. Besides, the Padrone and his men will surely find you if you stay. With Salvatore gone, they may blame you for Randizzi's death. You must go, but do not worry. I will see that Salvatore is laid beside your mama and papa, back in Avoletto. I promise you this." "I want Salvatore," Antonio sobbed from under the quilt. "Salvatore is in heaven with Mama and Papa now," Francisco told him. "When can I go to heaven to be with them?" Antonio asked, poking his head out from under the blanket. "Ah, little one, such a question," Father Tommaso sighed, scooping up Antonio in the quilt in his big, strong arms, placing him on his lap. "It's not for us to say when our time on earth is through. It's not for us to decide. It is God who makes those decisions." "But what if God makes mistakes?" Antonio whispered. "How do we know he meant to take Salvatore?" "That is what faith is all about," Father Tommaso replied. "Everything happens for the best reasons that we know little about. Believing in the best is believing in God's goodness. Your mama had great faith, but the best doesn't always happen," Dominic blurted out. Everyone turned looking at him, and they felt his cheeks burning with embarrassment at the sudden attention. "Yes, this is true. Good things don't always happen," Father Tommaso nodded. He gently lay Antonio down. Then he walked over to the little crooked window on the far wall. He held back the frayed bit of curtain that hung over the frame. Dominic took a deep breath as the faint scent of lemons blew into the loft on the night's breeze. "Look at those distant hills in the moonlight," the priest sighed. "Our whole world, our life, is very much like that little patch of hillside you boys have lived on. There are beautiful flowers and olives and lemons, but there are bad things too. Weeds that choke the flowers, worms that infest the fruit, good and bad, side by side. Flowers blooming and fading, leaves twirling up to the sun, fruit rotting on the vine. It goes on, changing all the time. One day you'll be able to look at everything and discover strength and goodness in the most difficult of changes. For it is the hardships we meet in life that make us strong. It is our strength that makes us who we are." "Oh, poor child, he is gone now. He is gone," the woman's cries could be heard from below, causing Antonio to bury his head under the quilt. Again, Dominic fought the tears that were coming to his eyes. "Now you'd better get some rest," whispered Father Tommaso. "You'll need all your strength for your trip." As Dominic lay down beside Antonio, Father Tommaso walked over to the Francisco. The two of them stood by the moonlight window, where they whispered until the priest turned down the lantern and sent him to bed with the other boys. "The sky is full tonight," Father Tommaso said. Dominic turned to look. Father Tommaso's back was to him. His bald head gleamed in the moonlight, and beyond a little crooked window frame, the twinkling of starlight spread throughout the velvety blackness of the night. Carrying the unlit lantern in his hand, Father Tommaso made his way down the ladder. As Dominic lay beside the boys in the darkness, he brought his arms close to his chest and gently rocked himself back and forth, waiting for the hurt to go away. "Dominic," Francisco whispered in the darkness, "I promised I would return your kindness the day you took the whip for Antonio, and I meant it. I want you to take Salvatore's ticket and come to America with us. I know he would have wanted it this way. Will you come with us?" Again the words of the old man from the museum came back to him. "Open your heart, little one, and all that you need will be yours." Dominic thought about how he had opened his heart and how much he had cared about Salvatore, only to find himself hurting now that he was gone. His worst fears had been realized. If he really cared about someone, he surely would lose him. But now that he had opened his heart, he didn't know how to close it. Dominic's eyes filled with tears as his answers came easily. "Yes," he whispered, his voice choked by a sob. "I'd like that. I'd like that a lot." The boys lay silently in the dark, and the only sound that broke the silence was a stifled cry from Francisco as he buried his face in Violetta's soft white fur. Okay, so the boys are kind of having a realization that he really is gone. And what did they do with Salvatore's ticket?
Took it, gave it to
Who'd they give it to? Dominic. Okay, so now it's going to be Dominic and Antonio and Francisco going to America. Okay, 24. The next morning they were awakened early so they could get down to the ship in time for boarding. Senor Garcia had draped the front doorway in black silk, marking a death in the house. The new bishop, just transferred from Milan, had seen the doorway on his morning stroll, and though it was not normally done, he stopped in to inquire about the deceased. He and Father Tommaso prayed together for Salvatore's soul. A bishop is like, okay, so in a school we have assistant principals, okay, and then we have a superintendent, like assistant superintendent and superintendent. Okay, so in the Catholic Church, the superintendent per se would be like the Pope, okay? The assistant superintendent would be like the bishops, okay? And then the priests would be like the principals. So this is like assistant superintendent level. So it's a bit higher up person in the Catholic Church, okay? Meanwhile, the boys had gathered under the arbor for breakfast. "The bishop does us a great honor in paying us a visit," Dominic heard Senor Garcia whisper to her husband as she laid the table with sweet cakes and fruit. Sitting there in the soft morning light, Dominic felt as if he had woken from a bad dream. If he closed his eyes, he could pretend that it was yesterday. He listened to the bees buzzing over his head just as they had done the day before. The birds were singing their familiar song, and the sun was as warm and comforting as it had been yesterday morning. It was almost as if everything was the same. But Dominic knew that inside something was very different. It was there in the little sitting room that all the still, lifeless body of Salvatore lay waiting for burial. The woman had washed him and combed his hair. Dominic and Francisco had taken Antonio in to see him, but Antonio was so upset that he had run from the room crying. He just couldn't believe that his brother would never wake up again. Even now, after they had finally settled him down under the arbor, Antonio kept looking back toward the house. Dominic knew that he was waiting for Salvatore to come walking through the doorway. Dominic himself almost expected to hear that familiar laugh and excited talk about roping buffalo and eating linguine under the stars. Even Violetta seemed inconsolable, for she had gone under the table and would not come out. Father Tommaso and the bishop joined the others at the table. Dominic watched as the bishop dusted his chair with a handkerchief and pulled from his sleeve before sitting down. Taking the utmost care, the bishop placed his fine silk hat on the bench beside him. "Such a fine hat, your lordship," Signora Garcia commented. "Grazie, signora, thank you," the bishop replied with a satisfied smile. With a haughty sniff, he surveyed the boys and brought his handkerchief to his nose, as if he had smelled something bad. In a strained voice, he began to speak about the salvation of Salvatore's soul. Francisco sat grim-faced while Antonio dipped his finger into a dish of jam. The bishop frowned. Okay, the bishop is like a fancy dude, okay? He's got this really, really nice silk hat. It's big and tall and it's pointed. Okay, and you think about like the class, like the boys are probably like about as low as you can go. They're pretty like, they didn't have a mom to tell them that, you don't stick your finger in the bowl of jam. Like, that's something my 3-year-old would do. These boys are older and they don't know that you don't do that. And the bishop is like, you guys smell, because he's going like this, because they're smelly. And he's just kind of like appalled at their table manners. This was followed by a soft burp from under the table. Upon hearing this, the bishop raised his eyebrows, and the boys stifled their giggles. Senor Garcia quickly changed the subject to church steeples. Grateful for the diversion, the grown-ups all turned in their seats to look at a steeple in the distance. It was then that Dominic heard a familiar nibbling sound and noticed that the bishop's hat was missing from the bench. He quickly kicked Francisco, who slipped under the table to retrieve the silk hat, which he quietly returned to the bench. Father Tommaso was anxious to leave for the ship, and the boys were just as anxious to leave before the bishop discovered the remains of his hat. After a rushed goodbye, they were on their way, and they hurried along the cobblestone streets towards the dock. Dominic heard a faint cry coming from under the arbor that sounded like, "My hat! My hat!" Figured it out. The goat ate his hat. Francisco had tied a rope around Violetta's neck to keep her safe as she trotted along beside him. All along the street, people talked excitedly about America and the ship, the New Amsterdam. Dominic smiled at the sound of it. America. He had realized for the first time since he had come how much he missed his own country, and he was suddenly overwhelmed by homesickness. As much as he had loved the countryside of Avoletto and the friendship he had found, he longed to see his familiar streets of Brooklyn. But as happy as he'd been about going back to America, he couldn't help but feel sadness that hung over the group now. The sadness of leaving Salvatore behind. The sadness of Salvatore's dreams going to America that could never come true. On reaching the pier, Dominic discovered that theirs was not the only difficult departure. Everywhere, people were crying. People cried and shouted goodbyes. Old women wrung their hands, and the grown men wailed like babies. Dominic remembered the ranger back at the museum saying that Ellis Island was known as the Island of Hope, and it was also the Island of Tears. Now he saw how tears could start even before the immigrants left their homelands. Slowly they made their way past many little stalls, selling clothes, baskets, boxes, and anything travelers might need for their journey across the ocean. They waited with Father Tommaso in one long line, then another, nervously eyeing the crowd. If the Padrone's men had gone up north to look for them, they had nothing to worry about. But if they changed their minds and headed south, Francisco would be in grave danger. After what seemed like hours, Father Tommaso finally handed their tickets to an agent, along with their papers. Dominic smiled at Antonio, who squeezed his hand. As the agent inspected their papers, Violetta tried to eat his shoelaces. The agent inspected their papers, and this is as far as the animal goes, the agent ordered in a gruff voice, shifting his foot from her reach. But she meant no harm, Francisco tried to explain. No animals on board, the agent snapped. But she's with me, Francisco told him. Makes no difference, he replied. No animals allowed. She wouldn't know how to get along without me, Francisco pleaded. We've never been apart, not one night. She wouldn't sleep or eat without me. Who could love her the way I do? The shipping agent shrugged. You don't understand, Father Tommaso insisted, taking the agent's arm. The boy has a ticket for America, and she belongs to him. Surely he'd be allowed to take her with him. She's a very well-behaved goat. The agent shook his head. Sorry, Father. Passengers are not allowed to take animals. If they allowed animals, there'd be no room for people. It's a big boat, but it isn't an ark. Oh, such nonsense. One small goat. Who would care? Father Tommaso grumbled as he waved his hand in the air. And then he turned to Francisco, whose face froze when he heard the agent's words. Move forward now and leave the goat behind. Man. So they lost their brother. Now they're losing their goat. They have to say goodbye to Father Tommaso. Chapter 25. Dominic watched as Francisco's hands clutched the rope tighter. Give me the rope, Father Tommaso said, placing his hand on Francisco's. I know how difficult this is for you, but I can't, Father, I can't, Francisco cried, kneeling down beside Violetta. Violetta moved close to him and tenderly licked his cheek, as though she knew what was about to happen. "Move forward, please," the agent's voice commanded. The man behind Francisco moved forward, nearly knocking him over. "My son, give her to me," Father Tommaso whispered. "I will take good care of her. I won't let her out of my sight, I promise you." Gently he took the rope out of his hand, but Francisco hugged Violetta to him, clinging to her for dear life. Violetta's eyes had widened with terror. "Francisco, I'm surprised at you," Father Tommaso said sternly, punctuating each sentence with a flick of his wrist. "You are the head of their family. Is this how you will act in America? You must set an example for Antonio. You must be brave." Francisco let go of Violetta, but he didn't take his eyes off of her. He finally stood up. "I'm sorry, Father," he said. "It's just that I shall probably never see her again." I know, my son," the priest whispered. "You probably never will see her again." He took all three boys in his arms at once, and teary-eyed gave them one last loving hug. Then he gave the rope a gentle tug. Violetta followed, looking back at Francisco with a questioning look. Francisco stared helplessly after her as Dominic grabbed him by the arm, and they made their way up the gangplank. Francisco was frantic to have one last look at Violetta. It was all Dominic could do to hold him back. They searched the crowd below, and through a blur of bodies, boxes, and baskets. Francisco was the first to spot her, although she couldn't see him. He watched as her frightened eyes searched through the crowd, looking from one person to the next. "I'm sorry," Francisco whispered. "I'm so sorry." He tried to smile through his tears. "Let her sleep near you at night, Father," he yelled into the roar of the crowd. "And don't let her eat bad weeds. And be sure to rub her nose each morning. She likes that." And suddenly his voice was drowned out by the deafening sound of the ship's whistle. The line surged forward, and Antonio clung to Francisco as they were carried along by the wave of people. The loud whistle of the ship blew again, and everyone turned back to look at the docks and wave goodbye to their loved ones. With tears streaming down his face, Francisco stumbled forward, searching in the sea of faces on the wharf. But by now, Father Tommaso and Violetta had blended into the mass of bodies. People shouted and called out to one another, their voices all blurred into one loud roar that echoed in Dominic's ears. "Arrivederci, goodbye, my sweet." He saw Francisco mouth the words, "Arrivederci, Avoletto, arrivederci." Dominic's eyes wandered over the crowd and then beyond them into the hills that rose up from the city. He remembered his first look at Avoletto, the sound of the birds and the bells and the gentle curves of the trees, and the bittersweet smell of lemons. He thought of the five of them there, Francisco, Salvatore, Antonio, Violetta, and himself. He remembered them talking and laughing and singing. He recalled the happy times they spent together on those sunny hills. "Goodbye, Avoletto," Dominic whispered, and as he did, he heard the hushed whispers of hundreds of goodbyes all around him. Okay, so they're on the boat. Where are they headed? America. Chapters from here on out are going to be very short.
I think they're going to kill the goat.
You think they're going to kill the goat back in Italy?
Yeah, and they eat it. Or sell the meat.
I don't know. We'll have to find out what happens.
Goat meat's good. Kill the goat.
I've never had it, but I had a professor in college who was from Africa, and they ate goat all the time. And he would talk about eating goat and how it was kind of tough.
Goat's good. I'm like,
I had goat cheese.
is it good?
I mean, yeah, it's kind of like
Have you ever had goat milk?
goat's milk. I've not had goat's milk.
That's
It's goat's
disgusting.
cheese. I mean, it's probably like cow's milk. I don't know what it tastes like.
Tastes disgusting. Tastes different.
Tastes different.
Tastes all sour and stuff.
Sour. Okay, 26. "All steerage passengers down the stairs," the voice barked. Dominic and Antonio were quick to follow the harsh command, while Francisco seemed to be in a daze. Together they found themselves in a crush of people, boxes, and baskets. A man with a thick mustache groaned as he heaved a heavy bundle onto his back that nearly knocked Antonio over. A baby wailed in Dominic's ears as an old woman leaned beside him, breathless under the burden of her parcels. It means packages. Everyone pushed forward. At the bottom of the stairwell, men and boys to the right, women and girls to the left. Families to the far end, came the second command. Maybe it's better that we're down here, a woman in front of them said. At least this way we won't feel the cold night air off the sea, and it will be drier. What does it matter where we have to stay? The man beside her answered. As long as we get to America. Yes, finally we're going to America, voices called out excitedly behind him. Going to America, Dominic repeated the words with a smile. He couldn't wait to show Francisco and Antonio his homeland. He couldn't wait to show them the streets he knew, and let them taste the food he liked. He imagined them all sharing a double fries and a couple of burgers, and he wanted to do everything with them. Watch TV, trade baseball cards, play hockey in the street. Do they really have electric lights in all of the buildings? He heard a voice break into his daydream. Of course they do, someone answered. It is 1908, and it is America. 1908? Dominic whispered under his breath. It wasn't going to be his America that they were sailing to. It wouldn't be like what he remembered at all. What would it be like? What was ahead of them? He wondered. What was ahead of them now was a stairwell, and they made their way down into a dark room. Then the crowd grew quiet. We're never going to fit in here, Dominic thought as he looked at the black iron framework that divided hundreds of narrow bunks. Each section had 3 tiers rising from bare wooden floor. Thin, straw-filled mattresses covered each bunk, and there were no pillows. Some bunks had thin, dirty blankets, but many did not. A bucket serving as a chamber pot was placed near every tier. You know what a chamber pot is? It's where they went to a chamber pot.
It sounds familiar.
It's like where they went to the bathroom. Okay, so on the boat there were like bunk beds, but each bunk had 3 tiers, and then down below each.
What tiers? Like what tiers are they talking about?
Okay, so you know, like on a bunk bed, you got 2 beds, one on top of each other, right? So here, so imagine you have beds. Here's your ladder. Okay, I'm really good at artwork, so I'm jealous of my strong buildings. Okay, then on each bunk was like a really thin mattress. Makes me think of like a dog bed. Okay, only these are filled with straw. Okay, so people would, like on here, the people would each have their own each person would have their own bunk. So to, like, one side would be all the boys, and this side would be all the girls. Families could stay together at the end. Okay? Now, the chamber pot was just like literally a 5-gallon bucket that sat in front of these 3 beds. And that's where they had to do their business.
So, and they're just leaving in their room?
Well, it's like one giant room.
Just gonna sneak up the whole room.
Well, each thing had 1 bucket. Okay? So, if there were 15 sets of 3 on this side, there'd be 15 buckets that people could go to the bathroom. Okay? Now, they're on a boat. You ever been on a boat? Okay.
I'm just scared to after the Titanic and like how.
So a boat isn't like smooth. Okay, so if you're driving in a car, you have a cup of water.
Actually, yeah, I have.
What's it gonna do? A cup of water with no lid, right? Oh, stop. Okay, you're still gonna have a lot of movement, and some water might slosh out. Okay, same idea on a boat. So these buckets, what are they probably gonna do?
Smell. Unless if they dump it outside the boat.
Okay, but how often do you think they really do that? Okay, now.
I do it all the time. Take it out every time I'm dumping it.
If you ever heard of people being seasick, okay, what happens when you get seasick?
They go up.
What happens if he gets seasick?
Throwing up.
What happens if he gets seasick?
He's throwing up.
What do they try to mix the bucket?
Yeah, get it everywhere.
Okay? Get this mental image in your head. When straw gets wet, like wet okay, so you know like when you have a wet towel in the bathroom and it sits too long and it gets that sour smell, and sometimes like wet things can mold, okay? So these mattresses, this boat is going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. It's not like all brand new stuff. It's old and dirty. So it's getting used by lots of people. Okay? It's not like a hotel where they come in and change the sheets out every day. Okay? So you got other people's funk, other people's sweat. Okay, these boats aren't like first class.
I want to be on a boat.
Alright, let's keep going. The boys found a set of bunks they could share with Francisco. Antonio took the bottom bunk and Dominic climbed up to the top. When Antonio complained that he was hungry, Francisco gave him a piece of bread that he had saved from the night before. The other bunks had filled up by this time, and there was a loud echo of voices as people tried to make themselves comfortable. Dominic has laid his head back on the rim of the thin mattress and closed his eyes. As eager as he was to explore the ship, he couldn't help but give in to the exhaustion he was feeling. But the moment he leaned back, his eyes popped open. "Ugh, what stinks?" he groaned. "It's the straw in the mattress," a man in the bunk beside him answered. "When it gets old and wet, it begins to rot. Try not to think about it. We'll be in America soon." But soon stretched out for days, and the stink of the moldy mattresses was replaced with the far worse smells. Almost everyone had brought food with them, and what was not immediately eaten had begun to spoil. The heat of so many bodies cramped together in such tight quarters with no ventilation gave to such an awful stench that by the third day the boys were forced to find relief on the open deck. So you got people who haven't showered in God knows how long. You got smelly mattresses. You got buckets full of human waste. And you have a bunch of rotting food.
How are you supposed to take a shower?
There were no showers. There was maybe like a bucket where you could kind of like,
Wash off like a towel.
yeah, but there weren't like a stash of clean
That sounds
towels.
like slavery.
Well, I mean, they weren't forced to do, I mean, they bought a ticket to do this. This is just the accommodations they could provide to them. This is 1908 on a boat in the middle of the ocean. So it's not like they had running water or
Is
anything.
that what they actually did back then?
Mhm. So our ancestors that came over here, unless you are 100% Native American, we've had family members who have come over to America who have probably dealt with something like this. Okay? Alright. Although the air was clean with a fresh breeze blowing off the ocean, it was so cold and damp. After they inspected as much of the deck as they could, climbing over great coils of rope and ducking under long lengths of pipe, they looked up at the well-dressed passengers strolling on the first and second class decks. Once, as they were staring up, a woman threw down an orange to them. But unlike those first-class passengers dressed in fur coats and heavy wool sweaters, Dominic and the others only had the shirts on their back to keep the sea's clammy breath. So they discovered that they could keep warm if they pressed against the ship's giant smokestacks. Huddled together there with half a dozen other boys, they traded stories about their dreams of living in America. They talked about how Francisco and Antonio would live in New Jersey, and while Dominic lived in New York. They hoped that one day they would all live together. Francisco grew quiet whenever they mentioned the animals, so Dominic tried not to talk about the pets he had hoped they could have one day. He knew how much Francisco was missing Violetta. Dominic hated to think of leaving them, but he was glad, at least, that he was returning to New York. He promised to save up his money and to come visit them every chance he got. But these conversations would come to a sudden end when the weather turned bad and when they entered choppy waters. With little warning, the ship would suddenly lurch up into the air at the crest of the billowing wave and then come crashing down on the water's surface. Soaked from the spray and terrified of being tossed overboard in the heavy gales, they would all scramble back to the safety of the steerage dormitories. On one such day, after returning from the smokestacks, Dominic found himself covered in a film of black grime. Unaccustomed to such filth, he suggested they clean up in the washrooms. "There are only 2 rooms for this," Francisco said limply, hanging over his bunk. "And look around you. There are hundreds of us. The lines are so long, why bother? We can wash when we get to America." "But this is disgusting," cried Dominic. "I can't stay this dirty until then. Besides, I thought you wanted to look good for America." "I do, but for now I'm feeling too sick to think of dirt. Everything seems to be moving. Maybe the dirt will move off with me as well." "Well, I can't stay like this," Dominic announced, climbing down from his bunk. "I'm going to try one of the washrooms." As he walked on the sticky, splintery floors, he thought about his old sneakers and how much he missed them. After waiting in line for what seemed like hours, he was finally able to move past the wooden partition of what he called the washroom. "A bathroom at last," Dominic muttered, stepping forward. "Ugh," he gasped, covering his nose with the hard to keep from breathing in this horrible stench. The sight that met his eyes was unlike the worst washroom he had ever been in. The bare wooden floor was sticky with waste, covered only by a thin layer of dirty sand that clung to his bare feet. There were no sinks, no towels, no toilets, and no toilet paper. There were only buckets, wooden buckets, filled with salt water to wash in, sitting beside the buckets filled to the brim with urine, waste, and vomit. If he hadn't felt sick before he entered the washroom, Dominic certainly did when he left. Okay. We will start chapter 27 tomorrow. I want you to get your reading guides out. Write the summary. What happened today?
Only question.
And then you can write it on the screen.